there is a sense, I think, that very close, clearly from the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton position, whatever the spin is, she won, but it was much closer than either they expected. Sorry, this being Iowa.
Right.
And that the Sanders challenge is at least here to stay for a while. In Iowa, which tends to be on the Democratic side, very, very liberal, her foreign policy credentials, which in many ways are much stronger and more complete than Senator Sanders, I don't think work very well. I'm reminded in my own work back to 2008 when I was working for Senator Al Gore in the presidential primaries, and Gore was moderate, and the other 7 Democratic candidates.
1998, was it 2008?
No, sorry, I got my years confused. 1988.
Oh my goodness.
Losing total track of time. 1988. We're back in the Reagan years and the missiles. In any event, he dropped out of the Iowa caucuses in part because his foreign policy credentials were doing no good. They were so liberal. So I think in this sense, it didn't hurt Sanders and it didn't help Clinton. But going forward, I think it's a card she'll play both on the issues themselves and as sort of the bank shot strategy to get at the leadership and electability question. So my sense is New Hampshire, South Carolina, the whole gamut, national attention, we will hear more from her, almost calling him out on foreign policy.
Well, from a Republican point of view, the criticism we would level against the Democratic debate thus far, the debate on the Democratic side, has been they haven't really spent much time talking about national security. You can go for long chunks of the televised debates and not get a serious question, let alone a serious answer. And so that changed, though, in the last week or so. Right before the week running up to the Iowa election, caucus, I should say, the Clinton team released a letter that was signed by some of their top people. Wendy Sherman, I think Jake Sullivan signed it, Nick Burns, who had worked in the Bush administration but now is on the Clinton team. This was their A-team of national security, foreign policy hands, making a pretty partisan political statement critiquing Sanders on foreign policy, saying that his answers and his positions showed a lack of seriousness, maybe even calling into question whether he could pass the commander-in-chief threshold test. That's pretty strong brew coming from the policy people who are supposed to be more arguing the details of policy. I took that as a sign first that Clinton team was worried about Sanders, and we now know why they should, because he almost won. But secondly, that they are doubling down on her national security credentials, which contrasts sharply with his lack of national security. He won't talk about the issue unless he's forced to. So I'm curious whether you agree that we're going to see sort of a nastier bar fight on the foreign policy side, and if so, will Senator Sanders come back with more than what he's come with so far? And what he's come with so far is, you voted for the Iraq War, I didn't. End of story. There's more that he could say than that. He could invoke the national security implications of the email controversy, for instance. Do you think he'll go there?
So I think on the Iraq War vote, when Barack Obama made that a core part of his campaign, it was very fresh. The war was still going on. The Bush administration was still in power, prosecuting the war, and it really was huge. I think all these years later, for some elements out there, it's still the be-all and the end-all, but it's much less significant. The emails, I think he'll play for a different reason. I don't think that really will raise that much at this point on national security implications of having these, top secret emails on our personal server. I think he's going to try to get at the authenticity and trust issue, because the exit polls in Iowa and the other polls show this has been a weak suit. And so it'll really be about her as a person. At the same time, I think she will, whether she calls him out and says, tell us what your foreign policy is, or just simply tries to play hers. What's the equivalent of the 3 a.m. phone call that she tried to use against Obama? What's the equivalent of that might work against Sanders? And I really think it's not just a list of issues. I mean, she has, in November, she gave, I think, a very well-received speech on ISIS and Syria and Iraq, when she wasn't thinking as much about Sanders and she was looking down the road. But I think she'll really try to use this as a way of thinking about leadership as manifested in foreign policy, but not necessarily foreign policy per se.
Well, the other thing she did in the weeks running up to Iowa is write some scripts for Republican critical ads in the general election. She hugged President Obama, wrapped herself in the mantle of President Obama, and more or less said, if you liked President Obama's foreign policy, you're going to like mine. And that's exactly what the Republicans are going to say in November. So that set up the Republican narrative going forward, which is going to be, we've had 8 years of this. The country can't take more than that.
What about among the Republicans?
Well, this is the interesting thing. If you and I had been talking months ago, that we might have said, well, Trump can't be taken seriously. And then in the weeks leading up to Iowa, you got the conventional wisdom flipped, and Trump went from not being taken seriously to being, holy cow, this guy might be a juggernaut. He might run the table. He might be unstoppable. And you saw the unseemly spectacle of Republicans trying to talk themselves into saying, well, he wouldn't be worse than Clinton, trying to make themselves comfortable with him. What we learned in the Iowa caucus anyway is that maybe voters could beat Trump. That is to say, he polls well, but he may not do so well at the ballot box. Certainly in the caucuses, he didn't do as well as he expected. So that opens the door, what makes it a more interesting race than maybe it looked just a week or two before the caucus. And it opened the door for a candidate in particular, the candidate who came in third,
that beat
Senator
expectations
Rubio.
in that, yeah.
Beat expectations, that's the big story. I mean, there's probably two big stories coming out of Iowa. Cruz defies and defeats Trump, but then Rubio emerges from the pack. The reason this is important for our conversation is that Rubio has made foreign policy, national security, his signature issue. There's him and Governor Bush, Jeb Bush. Those are the two who have invested the most in their foreign policy, national security aspect of their campaign, giving big speeches, talking about it, bringing the issue up even when it's not raised, and presenting fairly sophisticated policies, sophisticated by a primary election standpoint, where it tends to be reduced to sound bites. And so if Rubio really does have momentum going in, that could elevate the national security debate on the Republican side. There have been lots of questions and lots of responses on national security, but I think some people would criticize that the policy content of the debate has not yet reached what it could be, and maybe Rubio's rise will do that.
I can see that. I mean, I think Cruz, basically, when you ask what he said in foreign policy, it's make the sand glow, right? And I think that there is a sense that Rubio has a foreign policy approach. It has to be one I don't agree with, and I don't think it's good for the country. But I think the contrast that he'll play is, I've thought about these things, I've worked on these things. Cruz is running around, with his version of sound bites. And if you look at the opinion polling, not on the candidates, but on the issues, Americans' threat perceptions are very high, post-San Bernardino, post-Paris, and a variety of other factors. But they're staying very pragmatic, pretty prudent, one might say, on what policies they'll support. I might say that.
Yes.
And they haven't supported the Trump's ban on Muslims coming in the country. And so they may look at Cruz, other than a particular slice, and say, I'm smarter than that. He's a little too crazy for me, which would help Rubio. And so there too, I think Rubio will not so much convince people of all the details of his issue. That's not what they're interested in. But okay, he gets foreign policy. He looks a little young, rosy cheeks, may not be ready for commander-in-chief, but at this point, he's got his head on his shoulders where Cruz doesn't.
Well, the other candidates who are likely to do better in the weeks going forward would be other so-called establishment lane candidates like Jeb Bush, who I've already mentioned, but also Governor Christie and Governor Kasich. All of them have fairly well-developed foreign policy views that would resonate with the traditional Reagan constituency of the Republican Party. So we might see them coming forward in the future. You mentioned the sand glow. I just want to quickly mention before we close, Cruz's comment called forth something that's unusual, and that is a sitting uniform general making a comment that gets interjected into the partisan campaign, primary campaign. So a reporter asked the general to comment on this, carpet bombing make the sand glow, and normally a uniformed general would say, I'm just not going to comment on anything that's political like this, to stay as far away from partisan politics as they can. But in this case, he said that such a policy of carpet bombing without an indiscriminate bombing without concern for civilian casualties would not be in keeping with American values, and the military would not support it. And that's an interesting moment. It's not good for civil-military relations for the military to get dragged into election politics like that. But it might be an interesting moment of recalibration on the Republican side, because that's a powerful argument in a Republican audience, that what you're recommending the military thinks we can't do because it's against our values as a military. And so it might change that debate a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's going to be with us. This is a year that it's not either or between domestic issues and foreign policy issues. I think both are going to be in there. So it'll keep you and I off the streets, and we'll have to keep getting together.
We will just keep doing that.
That's right. See you.
Take care.
Okay.